Coming up on the Get Lean, Eat Clean podcast.
Everybody seems to know about B12, for instance, that B12 is an absolutely essential vitamin. You can't get it at all from plants, so you have to either supplement or get it from animal source foods. And it's quite serious. A serious B12 deficiency results in neurological damage and brain damage. So it is extremely serious. And so I think even that vitamin on its own should make you think, well, are we really destined to eat plants only? Because why would nature make it that way, that we can't get this really essential vitamin, right?
Hello, and welcome to the Get Lean, Eat Clean podcast. I'm Brian Grin, and I'm here to give you actionable tips to get your body back to what it once was 5, 10, even 15 years ago. Each week, I'll give you an in-depth interview with a health expert from around the world to cut through the fluff and get you long-term sustainable results. This week, I interviewed the author of The Great Plant-Based Con, Jane Buxton. We discussed how diets that exclude animal foods can damage your health, along with key nutrients you might be lacking if you avoid animal protein. Why does a powerful, rich church want to take meat off your plate? Are cattle to blame for our climate change? The shocking origin of your Kellogg's Corn Flakes breakfast cereal, and her one tip to get your body back to what it once was. Really enjoyed my interview with Jane. I know you will too. Thanks so much for listening and enjoy the show. All right, welcome to the Get Lean, Eat Clean podcast. My name is Brian Grin, and I have Jane Buxton on. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Very happy to be here.
Happy to have you on. I've heard you on some other podcasts, and I wanted to get you on specifically because of your recent book. I think March of 2023 came out, The Great Plant-Based Con. Love the title. What sort of led you down this path of getting into talking about, why plant-based might not be the best way to go for health?
Yeah, well, it's a good question because it wasn't a subject that I had written about before. And I would say that I wasn't an author looking for a subject. The subject literally found me. I became so engrossed in it, passionate about it, and I dropped the other things that I was writing. So it really was a case of the subject was kind of too important to ignore. And the reason it sort of came to me that way was 2019 seemed to me to be a year when the plant-based narrative was getting so much louder and stronger, more dominant. And there were a few things that happened that year. The C40 Cities Initiative, which was very plant-based drive through lots of cities around the world. Game Changers that very famously came out and attracted a lot of attention and made some young people, a lot of young people that I knew and saw around me, made them think about going vegan and feel guilty for not trying it. And I was looking ahead and thinking that we might have a very big health crisis on our hands if somebody didn't put the alternative view to this and start to get some reality checks into this whole discussion. And so I thought about it through most of 2019. I did research on my own, and then I just decided, no, it had to be a book. I wanted to get out there and be part of the discussion.
Now, at any point, were you a vegan or a vegetarian? Because sometimes you'll see, yeah.
I know a lot of people in this community have been, and they've come to omnivory because their own health failed, that kind of thing. No, that wasn't the case for me. Although what I will say is when I was growing up, I was the usual, teenager, young woman who was enamored of the whole low-fat theory. I loved vegetables more than I liked meat. And I would, go to a steakhouse and have a baked potato and a big salad when other people were eating beef. It wasn't because I was opposed to eating beef. It's just I love vegetables. But later, when I got older, and particularly after my 50s, I had noticed that my diet needed to be different. It needed to be more protein. And I wanted that for every benefit that protein gives you, but for muscle density in the main. It needed to be lower carbohydrate. And so my personal diet did change, but it wasn't from being a vegetarian.
Yeah, because you'll see that sometimes people have these big health transformations, and then they say, "Well, I got to, write about this." But this was came
Yeah.
to you more from. I know you mentioned the C40 initiative. What was that?
Yeah. So that was an initiative aligned with the Eat Lancet planetary diet initiative. And it was initially 14 cities around the world, including Sao Paulo, Toronto, London, a bunch of others, who committed to some initiatives to move towards plant-based.
Hmm.
And it's written down. They have a sort of manifesto, which is available if you seek it out online. And the goal is no meat and dairy being consumed in those cities by 2050. It's pretty drastic.
Wow.
Yeah.
And did they do this mainly because was it more of a money thing? I don't, a lot of times you see these initiatives and you just sort of follow the dollar, and that's the reasons that these cities do this. What
Yeah.
was the reasoning behind it?
Well, do you know, I didn't look into the dollar connections on that one,
Yeah.
and I don't know that that's the strong reason for this. I think it's a lot of it is virtue signaling when you look at the political level, like that, with a mayor of a city like ours, for instance. It's very much virtue signaling. What am I doing about net zero? How are we going to get our city towards that? I've got to be seen to be doing the right thing. And they think that that is the right thing. They think because they haven't done enough research to know what the dangers are, particularly when they start to talk about rolling out all vegetarian programs in schools, with kids under the age of 15 and very young kids too. So that's when it starts to get dangerous. So I was really attracted to the subject and felt compelled to write about it just as a concerned citizen more than anything else. Nothing to do with, as you say, my diet or anything, but as a concerned citizen and a parent.
Yeah, because I mean, if you listen to this podcast a lot, you'll understand that animal-based proteins obviously have a lot of benefits, like protein bioavailability. You're getting a lot of the things that you're not going to probably get from plant-based proteins. Let's talk about maybe what are some of the key nutrients that you found from your research and writing the book that people can sort of lack when they're not having animal proteins?
Yeah. I mean, the list is really quite long.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody seems to know about B12, for instance, that B12 is an absolutely essential vitamin. You can't get it at all from plants, so you have to either supplement or get it from animal source foods. And it's quite serious. A serious B12 deficiency results in neurological damage and brain damage. So it is extremely serious. And so I think even that vitamin on its own should make you think, well, are we really destined to eat plants only? Because why would nature make it that way, that we can't get this really essential vitamin, right? So that's the most obvious one. But then you move into things like vitamin A, and the form that we get from plants is not really vitamin A, it's beta carotene. It's not as bioavailable. And some people can't even convert it to the bioavailable form.
Mm-hmm.
You have D3. Vitamin D3 is far superior to the D2 that is found in plants, and it's much more active in the body. You have K2, you have heme iron versus plants iron. And again, heme iron is much more bioavailable. Then you have these kind of lesser known things that people don't talk about a lot, like creatine and
That was the one that I was thinking. Yeah.
taurine. And what I have found really fascinating as we learn more, and I learn something new every day about nutrition. I'm a bit of a geek about it, and I'm always reading the latest thing to come along. I noticed in the past couple of months, there have been two studies. One was about a particular protein type in dairy, and the other was about creatine. And both of these studies had come out, and articles were being written about them, about how important they were and how they could be cardioprotective. Mm. So I thought, well, this is great. So ingredients or nutrients, rather, that are from animal foods are being recognized here. But then you scroll to the end of the study, And rather than advocate for eating the foods that provide these very important nutrients, the authors say we are working on developing a supplement. And it's people are afraid to recommend that we eat these very important foods where we can get these nutrients. It's kind of like a dissonance that we have, all these nutrients are great in animal source foods, but for goodness sake, don't eat the animal source foods because they're bad for you. It's completely mad.
Yeah, I feel like as a society, we've gotten a little bit caught up on like what supplement should we take, or what protein shake. And I do protein shakes every time, not like every day, but from time to time, and I'll add some creatine in there. But I think most importantly, if you can get it from the actual foods that you're eating, that is, from nature itself, that's the most beneficial way of getting any of these nutrients.
Absolutely. And there's a big difference between, say, taking one or two supplements because your body doesn't seem to create that much of the vitamin from the foods,
Sure.
or because you can't get access to the particular food that you might want quite as much. That's a big difference from having this multi-vitamin kind of approach, which you definitely need if you're on a vegan diet.
Yeah. Yeah, that would be the big thing. If you're vegan or vegetarian, you obviously would have to supplement a lot more
A
than
lot.
if you were on more of an animal-based diet. What about the argument regarding climate change? And I know that's a big one. I've read a few books. Robb Wolf has written about it in the past. What did you find from your research that was sort of false, this false narrative around that, being a vegan or vegetarian is actually good for the climate?
Yeah, it is a false narrative. And it really has taken hold. I mean, there's almost nobody in regular circles that you can talk to that won't be shocked if you say to them that actually cows are not the drivers of climate change. So people have really bought this hook, line, and sinker. But really, I think there's a simple way of looking at this, and then there's a more complicated way. The simple way of looking at it is, okay, globally, cows are responsible for about 14.5% of emissions. That number is exaggerated for reasons I can get into in a moment, but the rest of the emissions picture, 85% of emissions come from other things. They come from fossil fuel use in industries primarily. So it's those industries which are driving carbon in the air and in the atmosphere, rather. So how anyone can think, Pat Brown the other day, Impossible Foods founder, was on camera on this latest Netflix documentary, which is diabolical in my opinion. And his closing line was that if we got rid of cows, we could eradicate and make up for all the other emissions from all other sources. Now, how bonkers is that, given that 15 to 85% sort of ratio? Then you get into the nuances of the story, which is the poor cattle, the way their emissions are calculated is on a life cycle basis. So everything that goes into the meat on the plate gets counted. Whereas for something like transport, we only count the tailpipe emissions, the direct emissions. So it's really underplaying transport and overplaying cattle. And if you were to calculate them in the same way, you'd find that globally cattle would be 5% of emissions, whereas transport would be 14. Then you look at countries like the US, where beef cattle are responsible for 2% of emissions. And the picture gets even more ridiculous. How anyone could think that we would save the planet by getting rid of that. And there was a study done 2018, I think. It was quite fresh when I started researching this. And it calculated it. It was a study by White and Hole, and it calculated that if all of America went vegan, we would reduce emissions by about 2.5%. That's it. And that would be at considerable nutritional cost. So people would suffer as a result of that. So whatever way you look at it, and there are other nuances as well, which do affect the equation. But I think what the bottom line is that the emissions and the impact from cattle is just overblown. It's very overblown. That's not to say that we can't improve, that we can't do better things with cattle for the land, for the soil, to reduce emissions even more. But this whole scapegoating is just insane.
Yeah, and what was the burger company that you mentioned, the plant-based burger?
Impossible.
Yeah,
Impossible. Yeah,
they've been trying to sort of lead that narrative, right? Like,
absolutely. Absolutely.
yeah,
And I don't know if people realize this, but Impossible Foods or Beyond, I must get this right, but one of those burger replacement burger companies has entirely funded the Stanford plant-based school, as it were,
Hmm.
which is run by ardent vegans, and also and they were the people that did this study, which went into the Netflix documentary. That was a severely compromised documentary. It was entirely biased from the get-go by the funding and by the people who were carrying out the study. And it's just another in a long line of those Netflix documentaries, which unfortunately have people persuaded. So I was in an event yesterday and I was talking to a woman and she heard about my book and she said, "Oh, really? That's very surprising. Tell me something about that." And I asked her what kind of information she had. And she said, "Well, I watched the documentary Cowspiracy.
Hmm.
And I heard that cows are responsible for 50% of all emissions." And she was completely flabbergasted that that was not true and that it was an exaggeration by 3 times or more. So unfortunately, these silly documentaries do have impact and they stick with people. And it's kind of depressing to see that.
Yeah, you would think like with all these documentaries on either side, like there should be
Mm-hmm.
some type of vetting.
Yeah.
That right?
Well,
Like,
objective. Yeah.
because I mean, we talk about some of the education that goes on that or lack of or misinformation that's being taught in schools, let's just say.
Mm.
And this is the same thing, like these documentaries are being sent out to the world and people just assume that they're right. It's like,
Mm.
there should be.
Although I do think maybe people are getting smarter. I don't know whether you think that, but I think people are getting more cynical.
Mm.
And again, at another event I spoke to on Tuesday, there were about 100 people in the room. And the consensus view was that this had been a very quiet veganuary, that there's kind of a retrenchment. And
A very quiet what?
veganuary. Do you
Oh,
have veganuary over there? Yeah.
oh, is that a UK?
Well, it started, I think it's global, but I think it's quite big here. It's where people go vegan for a month to try it. And it's really promoted by vegan societies and charities and whatnot. And it has been attracting more and more attention for the past few years. But this year was super quiet. You didn't hear anything about it much.
Hmm.
And so everybody in this room that I was talking to had noticed that. And they'd also noticed that there's quite a retrenchment in the plant-based sector itself, product-wise. People are struggling. Companies are struggling. Restaurants are closing. Have we reached peak vegan already? Are we about to see a turn? And is that why people are a bit more cynical about this new documentary that's come out? Are their eyes already open? I wonder.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we have dry January here.
Yes, we have that too. Yeah.
Okay. But I've not heard of how do you say it?
Veganuary.
Veganuary. Okay. I'll
Yeah.
have to see that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting because if you look at a label of Impossible Burgers, I remember there was a time where this was probably like 6 years ago, was sort of like a pescatarian.
Mm-hmm.
And I would occasionally make like a veggie burger on top of a salad and a bunch of stuff on it. And I remember looking at the veggie burger ingredients because I was savvy enough to do that. And I was like, I don't want all these things. Like this is like so manufactured. Like all these, with the vegetable oils and things like that. I did find a few that were like 5 ingredients. I'm like, oh, okay, I can use
Hmm.
that. But even the fact that if you look at a lot of these Impossible Burgers, and what's the other company you mentioned?
Beyond,
Yeah, the
beyond.
Beyond Burger.
Yeah.
I mean, just looking at the label itself just will tell you whether it's vegan or not, that you probably shouldn't eat it.
Yeah, yeah. And there's a whole new crop of those things coming up. Of course, those highly processed foods. There's one called Wicked Kitchen in the States, and that was again promoted by this Netflix thing. And you look down at the ingredients, and it's horrifying. I mean, there's dextrose, there's methylcellulose, there's fillers galore. There's something that looks very like a trans fat. It's this strange fat that they describe that looks very trans fat like. Um, and but it made me laugh actually because the documentary goes along and says processed foods are very, very bad for you, really bad for you. Don't
Mm,
eat them unless they're a vegan processed food, and then they're terrific.
mm,
So there's this double standard being applied to all of this really highly processed food
yeah,
that we should
yeah,
be
right.
eating.
Just doesn't make sense. I think if you're an informed consumer and you at least have an idea about reading ingredients and labels,
Mhm.
it just doesn't
Mm.
bot. It's like when I went to get food for my dogs. When I adopted my 2 dogs, and the vet's like, "Oh, well, you can try what we have." And I look and I'm reading the label. I'm like, "Is this really what dogs eat?" Like,
Yeah.
like this kibble with these fillers and these these ingredients you can't pronounce. And I'm thinking, I think I'm going to transition them to raw. And I just been
Yeah.
feeding them raw diet ever since, and they've been thriving.
And they're thriving, right? Yes. So my sister is a vet in Canada, and she and I have been along on this journey really together. We debated a lot about these things. She helped me to think about the book and how I wanted to put the message. And but she noticed a long time ago that the food that was being recommended for dogs was just rubbish. It was the equivalent of human crap food.
Right.
And so she started to recommend, raw feeding or at least grain free, So, I mean, dogs
Hmm.
really don't need grain, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Um, so that's what I haven't gone over to raw yet because my kitchen setup doesn't, I'm a bit worried about separating it all, but maybe it's a mountain I need to climb.
Well, yeah. And I mean, now I buy like it's frozen raw, so it just stays in my freezer, and then I'll just take it out like 5-10 minutes before they're going to eat. They eat it,
Hmm.
and then it's pretty easy. It's definitely
Pretty
more,
okay.
yeah, pretty easy for sure. It's definitely more a little. Well, it can be more expensive because these these dog companies, they charge a little bit more for raw food, but
Of course.
it's like
Yeah.
anything else. You pay for what you get.
Hmm. Hmm. And your dogs are healthy, so good.
They're great. Yeah.
I
Um,
can see them wandering around behind you a little bit.
yeah, they've settled. I base my when I do podcast interviews around my dogs and
Yeah,
whether they're going to be sleeping
happy
or
or
not.
not.
Yeah.
Yeah,
uh,
yeah.
let's touch. I think you touched a little bit on your book about sort of the origin of the Kellogg's Corn Flakes breakfast
Mhm.
cereal. Uh,
Mhm.
yeah, do you mind touching on that? I think that's been out for a while, but it's sort of disturbing, I'd say.
It is disturbing. I mean, of course, the person with the most in-depth knowledge of this, I always must credit her, is Belinda Fettke, who lives in Tasmania, who put together the whole picture, really. Um, and really, the story, which always fascinates people, because nobody really has heard of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, or very few people in their daily lives. They don't see it around. Not every village has a Seventh-day Adventist church, certainly in this country. Um, so people are, if I ever mention this, or if people read the chapter and ask me about it, they're always thinking they I know that they're thinking, well, why should we really be that concerned? It's just a little church. It's a fringe church. What's the problem?
Mhm.
But the problem lies in its origins and in its how it's interwoven itself into particularly American dietary policy. So, very briefly, Ellen G. White founded the church in 1863 based on a vision from God. And one aspect of that vision was how people should eat. And it should be the Garden of Eden diet, which was a vegetarian diet. Um, she developed a philosophy which was, that meat eating would cause people to sin, to have impure sexual thoughts, masturbation, all of those things. And John Harvey Kellogg was a young boy at the time who helped her to type out these pamphlets. So he was obviously reading them all. He was absorbing this message about meat being making people impure, and he went on to found a company which was creating foods that would fight against that. So cereal-based foods, which would not make them impure, and which was, curb the tide of masturbation and terrible behavior by young men. So that was the origin of the Kellogg's company. And I think if people knew that's the origin of modern vegetarianism, they might be a little shocked. But then it gets worse because his proteges, including a dietitian called Lena Cooper, took this philosophy, which is very vegetarian oriented, anti-meat, into the dietetics textbooks, all the schools. They founded the dietetics schools. Then they started to infiltrate dietary advice committees, the guidelines committees, which have become such a fixture in America and which do influence guidelines around the world. And a great many of the members of the Dietary Guidelines Committee today are Seventh-day Adventists. And I was shocked right at the outset of this, my research, when I came across this study in 2019 by Marco Springman, who's an environmental scientist, but he's also a vegan. And he came out with this study, which is the typical study that we're seeing these days when people model all the different foods. And it's always animal foods bad, plants great. And it was reported globally and in The Economist here, very high profile magazine. And then I looked at the study and saw that it had been peer reviewed by a leading professor at the Seventh-day Adventist University, Loma Linda. And he also sits on the Dietary Advice Guidelines Committee. So that's how we continue to be influenced by Seventh-day Adventist thinking. It's because of the people who were involved in the science, pretending that it's science, when in fact it's philosophy, it's belief. It's quite scary, actually, because it's really under most people's radar.
Yeah. So the origin of Kellogg's cornflakes was mainly to help make people not have kids. Right?
I guess so. Or no, not have impure sex. I suppose I don't know what they thought about normal sexual activity, but it was impure, illicit sexual activity, masturbation in particular, and undue thinking about this. I guess it was all pretty Victorian.
Wow. Yeah. It is. And, it's interesting because you see studies that come out and I always say, well, who funded the study, right? Like, you got to sort of follow the money on all this stuff and just be cynical, I guess that's the right word. Or skeptical, I should say. Skeptical on any study that comes out, right?
And my advice to people, if they don't have time to read all the studies, which of course people don't, is go straight to the discussion and the limitations at the end of the study. This is where all authors of studies have to tell you exactly what the study didn't tell you, what was wrong with it, why the results may not be that convincing. That's what you want to know first. Yeah.
And like there are so many studies going one way or the other. It's like you can sort of drive yourself crazy. I think most importantly, and I'm not sure what you think of this, Jane, but like self-experimentation, like try it out yourself, see how you feel. I mean, we can always say what our experience is, or if we're working with clients, what their experiences are. But I'm always a fan of self-experimentation and just sort of finding what works for you.
I agree. The sort of N=1 experiment, right? Yeah, I think that they're valuable. And one of the reasons is we're all so different that, and our biochemistry, our genetics, everything is so different that what makes you thrive may not make me thrive, and vice versa. The only caveat I would add to that is if you're going to experiment with diet and food, be honest with yourself
Mm,
and really understand what's happening in your body, track what's happening in your body. So there's no point in thinking, oh, I'm really thriving on this vegan diet if you're not measuring your B12 stores, and
yeah,
5 years later, they're nothing and you're already suffering the damage. You have to keep track. You have to be on top of it. I think if you're going to try anything other than a balanced omnivore approach, you have to be on top of what that's doing to your body.
yeah, no doubt. Because sometimes you don't feel those symptoms until years later,
Too
right?
late.
Yeah, and at that point, you might be deficient in a nutrient that, like you mentioned, the B12 or whatever else it is, choline, creatine.
Yeah.
Um,
Or your
so,
blood sugars might be out of whack, so
yeah,
you need to be keeping on top of glucose. You might be pre-diabetic by the time you discover that you've been eating too many carbohydrates. And this is the thing with a vegan diet, it tends to be high carbohydrate because there is nothing else. You've taken all the animal proteins out. You got to fill them with something. And those sources of protein and iron that are plant-based tend to come with a high carbohydrate load. It's just inevitable.
right. And I'm not like anti-carb. I've actually introduced more whole base food carbs into my life, mainly from fruits. Um,
Yeah.
but I want one thing I do keep an eye on is like protein intake. And I
Mhm.
find with individuals, most people, for the most part, are under eating protein. I don't think you need to go crazy with it. I think sometimes that gets a little bit blown up. Like I think like what I've heard is about zero point 0.7 to zero point 0.8 grams per body weight per pound of body weight is sufficient for most people. But if you're not filling it with protein, then you're just adding in a bunch of maybe junk that you shouldn't be having. And
Mhm.
protein is obviously very satiating as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
What are your thoughts on vegetable oils?
Ah, well, I did cover that in the book. I called them one of the bad guys, that might
Yeah,
sneak into your diet inadvertently if you decide to cut out animal foods.
right.
Because of course you're cutting out animal fats, so you're bound to use more vegetable fats. And vegetable oils are cheap
Mm,
and they're ubiquitous. They now there's their biochemical content, which makes them uh, bad for our health because they oxidize so easily when they're heated and in the body. So we get oxidation, and that's never a good thing. They also have a very high omega-6 content. Um, and really that we need to be watching that because the omega-6 content of our diets has increased dramatically in the past 50 years. Um, the content of our adipose tissue has increased. So omega-6, linoleic acid has gone from about 9% to 22% in those 50 years. And that can't be good. It can't be normal. It's not the way we were built. It's not the way it should be. So I avoid them like the plague. But to avoid vegetable oils, you have to avoid processed food because almost every processed food has vegetable oil in it because it's cheap. They're never going to put butter, and they're rarely going to put olive oil.
Yeah. I recently, it's not out yet, but I've had him on a bunch. Jay Feldman. I don't know if you're familiar with Jay.
Oh, yeah, I
Yeah.
love his work. He's great. Yeah.
And he's part of sort of that bioenergetic viewpoint on maximizing cellular energy. And one of the
Yeah.
culprits of maximizing cellular energy is this high PUFA content that you're getting from
Hmm.
vegetable oils, especially cooked vegetable oils. Um,
Hmm.
so it's definitely a narrative that seems to ring true. I mean, I just go back to like the common sense of like if you just research how they make vegetable oils,
Yeah. Yeah. You
right?
really
Like,
want that in your body. Yeah.
yeah, like it's just like, okay, this just doesn't seem right. Like, I don't
Yeah.
care like what the experts say. Like, I like this refinement process just doesn't seem right.
It's so mechanical, isn't it? And yeah,
Yeah.
it's extraordinary but I think you're right. It's a common sense approach. If you just ask people to think about that, they would come to the right conclusion, whereas our ancestors, our grandparents were eating goose fat, butter, tallow, um,
Yeah.
back,
They
the
weren't
night.
they weren't eating low fat snack wells. You remember those?
They sure were not. No.
I remember my mom bought those, and I was younger at, I don't know how, the 10 years old, let's just say, and
Yeah.
I never liked them. I always thought they just tasted weird. Do you know what I'm saying? Some people
Fake?
like,
They taste fake to you?
yeah,
Because
they just
yeah.
there was something that was wrong. Just like I remember thinking back, and I never really liked them.
Mm.
Those Snackwell low fat ones. I'm sure if you're probably 30 or 40 and above, you probably remember those, that low
Yeah.
fat craze.
Yeah. Yeah.
What what's your routine? I like asking about routines. I'm just curious, Jane, like what's your routine as far as just like eating and how do you sort of balance out your meals throughout the day?
Well, um, I would say I'm mostly low carb. I'm not fanatical about it, but I do better without too many carbs. So I'm usually under 40 grams of carb a day, 50 grams. A blowout day would be definitely 70 grams of carbs. I eat probably 2 meals a day. So most of the time I'm eating late breakfast, early lunch, and then dinner.
Hmm.
And more recently, I've added in an electrolyte drink in the morning just to get my hydration up. And I do a 24-hour fast about once a week.
Oh,
So, and
so
I
like a
don't
like dinner to dinner sort of
dinner
thing.
to dinner.
Got it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not very difficult. Um, uh, you're hungry. By the time you get to an hour before your next dinner, yeah, you're hungry. And the reason I do that is partly about keeping weight under control, but it's also trying to get some sort of benefits of autophagy, which now it's debatable whether at 24 hours I'm getting those benefits because I have read that they don't really kick in till you get to 48 hours. Um, all the same, I think I can't be bad. I must be getting some benefit for that. And maybe I'll work my way up to the 48 hours every now and again. But somebody asked me the other day, how had my thinking changed since I wrote the book?
Oh,
And really, uh, I'm just much more conscious and I'm much more aware that the reason I'm eating food is for nutrition. It's of course, it's about taste. It's about entertaining people. It's about culture. It's about enjoyment, family, sharing. Food is all of those things. But at its very core, I want it to make me really healthy, to make me, to enhance my longevity, to enable me to enjoy life. And so I'm very conscious of trying to get all the nutrients that I want. And it's always in the back of my mind.
yeah. I mean, that's a great way to think about how to eat, right? Like I always say, like obviously being active is important as well. And whether one comes first or the other for some people that I work with, if you get them moving and doing the right things, let's just say strength training, which I think is really important for anybody,
Yeah.
especially as
Yeah.
you get older, then they start to become more conscious of what they want to eat and what they want to
Hmm.
put in their bodies because they know they want to perform at a certain level. And that's really what food is meant for, right? To maximize, like Jay would say, your cellular energy and perform at sort of the peak level that you can get
Yeah.
to.
Yeah.
And so that's why it's like you said, you perform maybe a little bit better on a lower carb approach. I've tried both. I mean, I go back and forth a little bit, but like I've tried eating certain things and trying some pre-workout things and
Mhm.
post-workout and just sort of seeing what works. I will say, just some people, I think it can be a little bit like a false presumption. Is like if you go from a standard American diet and then you go to any diet that takes out processed foods, you're going to probably feel better, right? So like
Yeah.
people will go from a standard American diet to a vegan or vegetarian diet, they might feel better, which is obviously rightfully so because they've gotten rid of a lot of the processed foods that they were normally consuming. But you got to ask yourself eventually, will this serve me in the long term?
Yeah, and people call that the vegan honeymoon, right? So you can feel good, and the honeymoon might last a few months in some people, it might last a few years in other people. But at some point, for most people, the end of the honeymoon comes, it arrives, and you don't feel good. Which is why we see, the typical duration of vegan diets is about 3 months. People try it, and then they go back. They'll go back for different reasons, but I think one of the main reasons is going to be they don't feel good.
Yeah. Well, this was great. What your book, you came out March of 2023. How long did it take you to write it?
Well, it came out March 23 in the US, I think, because it was later than in the UK. It was June 2022 in the UK. So it's 2 years old here now. The paperback is 1 year old. Sorry, what was your second question? Was it what?
I just asked you how long it took. I've written a couple books. I'm always curious.
It took a couple of years and then a year in editorial and legal, because it was when it hit the publisher's desk, when I submitted the final version, the lawyers were a little bit antsy about it because I was being critical of quite a lot of established organizations and people. So we went over it to be very careful about exactly what I was saying, and whether it was libelous or not. So that was a long process and probably a worthwhile process.
Yeah. They wanted to make sure that you weren't stepping on too many people's toes.
Yeah, or at least if I was going to step, then be very sure about the facts that are backing up. And I think it's really interesting because nobody has come forward to question what I've written now. Could be because they're just ignoring me, or it could be because what I'm saying is true. And if they protest, then their secret is going to come out, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, the Great Plant-Based Con.
Yeah.
Why eating a plant-based diet won't improve your health or save the planet. Great book. And you can find it everywhere, right? On Amazon. It's on
in bookstores that are brave enough to stock it, because some of them aren't, or they hide it in the back shelf. So you have to go find it sometimes.
Okay. Yeah, I wrote a kid's book years back, and I was getting it into different small bookstores, which was great. But, we know that, like, I don't know what percentage of book sales is online, but I'm sure it's a high percentage.
Yeah. Yeah, so, it is. It is. And if it gets more books into more people's hands, that's great. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Because I think books like this are important to read. And they're this narrative that, you must go plant-based to be healthy, I think is, like you said, I think it is sort of maybe quieting a bit from just people like yourself and just getting on podcasts and getting the word out.
And I talk to anyone I can about it in my real life too. So I'm probably poor, but it's part of my role.
Yeah, no, I hear you. And I appreciate you coming on the podcast. Let me ask you one last question. If you were going to give one tip, I might know it, but maybe it's something a little different, to individuals who are looking to get their body or mind back to what it once was 10, 15 years ago, what one tip would you give them?
Can I have a 2-part tip?
Sure, we'll give you 2.
Stick to real food. Avoid stuff in packages. That's a pretty good rule. And make sure you have some animal source foods at every meal. Even if it's just an egg, please, because they're superfoods, eggs. And I think you can't go too far wrong if you do that. Love that.
Well, Jane, I appreciate you coming on. Love the book. And we will put links in the show notes for everybody to check out your materials. And thanks again for coming on the podcast.
Thank you very much. Okay, have a good day.
You as well. Thanks for listening to the Get Lean, Eat Clean podcast. I understand there are millions of other podcasts out there, and you've chosen to listen to mine, and I appreciate that. Check out the show notes at briangrin.com for everything that was mentioned in this episode. Feel free to subscribe to the podcast and share it with a friend or family member that's looking to get their body back to what it once was. Thanks again, and have a great day.